Picture this moment with me. You wake tomorrow morning, reach for your phone, and see a notification that changes everything. The emergency alert reads simply, "All coastal areas evacuated. Sea level rise unprecedented." You think it's a mistake, maybe some glitch in the system. But as you scroll through social media, the images begin to flood your screen, and I mean that literally. The Statue of Liberty stands waist-deep in churning water, her torch barely visible above waves that crash against what used to be Ellis Island. Times Square has become Times Sea, with yellow taxis floating like forgotten toys between the digital billboards that still somehow flicker beneath the surface. The Golden Gate Bridge stretches across an ocean that now reaches San Francisco's hills, its towers rising from waters so deep that ships could sail beneath its span. This isn't the gradual sea level rise that scientists have warned us about for decades. This isn't the slow creep of climate change that gives us time to build seawalls and relocate communities. This is something impossible, something that defies every law of physics we understand. Overnight, every coastline on Earth has vanished beneath waves that have risen hundreds of feet in mere hours. The morning news anchors, those who can still broadcast, speak in voices that shake with disbelief. Entire nations have disappeared. The Maldives, gone. Parts of Florida, swallowed. The Netherlands, despite their legendary flood defenses, claimed by waters that rose faster than any human preparation could match. But here's what haunts me about this scenario. It's not just the drowning that would destroy us. The first wave is only the beginning. The real danger comes after. Now, let's step back for a moment and ground ourselves in what we know. In our real world, sea levels rise through processes that unfold across decades and centuries. When glaciers melt in Greenland and Antarctica, that water finds its way to our oceans, adding volume drop by precious drop. When ocean water warms due to global warming, it expands. Thermal expansion, scientists call it, pushing water levels higher inch by inch. These are the mechanics of climate change that we live with today. The gradual rise that gives us time to see it coming, time to adapt, time to build higher seawalls and relocate communities before the water arrives. Current projections suggest we might see 3 to 8 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. Devastating, yes, but manageable if we act wisely. But what we're imagining tonight is different. What if some impossible force, cosmic, geological, or beyond our current understanding, compressed centuries of rising seas into a single night? What if the thermal expansion happened in hours instead of decades? What if every glacier and ice sheet melted simultaneously, dumping their frozen contents into the oceans faster than physics should allow? The mathematics alone are staggering. To raise global sea levels by the hundreds of feet we're envisioning would require adding approximately 400 billion gallons of water to the oceans. That's more water than exists in all the Great Lakes combined, multiplied by thousands. It's a volume so vast that it challenges our ability to even conceptualize it. Yet in our impossible scenario, it happens while you sleep. No warning systems could prepare for it because no warning system was designed for the impossible. Seismographs might detect strange readings, but who would interpret sudden ocean floor displacement on a global scale? Tide gauges would break before they could measure the initial surge. If the seas rose in hours instead of centuries, humanity would have no warning. So what would break first? The answer comes in the form of America's greatest urban achievements becoming aquatic graveyards. Let's start with New York City, that magnificent vertical maze where 8 million souls wake each morning. The subway system, that underground circulatory system that pumps millions of people through the city's veins, becomes a death trap in the first hour. Water pours down every stairway, every ventilation grate, every entrance that once welcomed commuters. The tunnels that took decades to carve through Manhattan bedrock fill like bathtubs in minutes. The express trains, those iron serpents that connected Brooklyn to the Bronx, become underwater monuments to human ambition. Grand Central Terminal, with its celestial ceiling and golden light, transforms into a submerged cathedral where fish might one day swim through halls that once echoed with footsteps. Move west to Miami. That sun-soaked paradise built on drained wetlands and wishful thinking. The Art Deco hotels of South Beach, those pastel monuments to human optimism, stand like colorful reefs in the new ocean. The MacArthur Causeway disappears entirely, leaving Miami Beach as an actual island again, if it remains above water at all. The Everglades, already struggling against human encroachment, merge seamlessly with the new coastline, creating a vast aquatic wilderness where alligators and marine life negotiate new territorial boundaries. Los Angeles tells perhaps the most surreal story of all. The Pacific Coast Highway vanishes beneath waves that now lap against the Hollywood Hills. The Santa Monica Pier, with its iconic Ferris wheel, becomes a lighthouse marking the spot where California's dreams once met the shore. Downtown LA's skyscrapers rise from an inland sea, their glass surfaces reflecting waves instead of desert sunlight. The freeways that once carried millions in their daily migrations become underwater canyons where marine life might someday establish new migration routes. Cross the Atlantic to London, where centuries of careful planning along the Thames means nothing when the Thames becomes indistinguishable from the North Sea. Big Ben's clock tower marks time for a city that exists now, only in its upper floors and highest points. The Tower Bridge spans water so deep that the largest ships could pass beneath it with room to spare. But perhaps nowhere tells this story more dramatically than in Shanghai. That vertical city of 24 million souls built on a river delta that never stood much above sea level anyway. The Oriental Pearl Tower, that space-age spire that defined Shanghai's skyline, now serves as a lone beacon rising from an endless ocean. The Huangpu River and the Yangtze merge with the new sea level, creating an aquatic megalopolis where only the tallest skyscrapers hint at the human civilization that once thrived below. This is the new geography of our drowned world, familiar landmarks transformed into navigation markers for a planet that no longer recognizes itself. But drowning cities are only the visible disaster. The invisible one lurks in the shadows. What you can't see in those haunting images of submerged cities is the intricate nervous system of modern civilization shorting out beneath the waves. Every power plant built near water for cooling purposes, and that's most of them in coastal areas, faces immediate shutdown. Not gradual failure, but instant catastrophic failure as salt water invades electrical systems never designed to function underwater. The electrical grid doesn't just go dark, it dies. Transformers explode in showers of sparks before the water even reaches them, triggered by the massive electromagnetic disruptions of a power system trying to function while drowning. From Boston to San Diego, the lights don't just go out, they go out forever, at least until someone can rebuild an entirely new infrastructure on higher ground. But electricity is just the beginning of our cascade of failures. Deep beneath our feet, an invisible network of fiber optic cables carries the conversations, transactions, and dreams of billions of people around the globe. These underwater internet cables, ironically, were designed to function in the deep ocean, but they weren't designed for the violent turbulence of suddenly rising seas, for the debris of collapsed buildings, for the shifting geography of a world transforming overnight. When these cables snap, entire continents lose contact with each other. The internet doesn't slow down. It fragments into isolated islands of connectivity. Your smartphone becomes a pocket-sized paperweight. Video calls in mid-sentence, never to reconnect. The global economy doesn't crash. It simply vanishes into the digital void. Freshwater systems face an even more insidious death. Water treatment plants, built at sea level for obvious reasons, don't just flood. They become contaminated beyond any hope of quick repair. The pumps that push clean water up to higher elevations drown in the same salt water they were designed to keep separate from our drinking supply. Within hours, cities that somehow maintain power discover that turning on the tap produces only brackish, undrinkable seawater. Hospitals, those fortresses of healing we depend on in any crisis, find themselves transformed from places of refuge into monuments to human helplessness. Emergency generators, typically stored in basements for security and noise control, flood before they can even start. Elevators stop working. Medical equipment that requires constant power, dialysis machines, ventilators, incubators in neonatal wards, falls silent precisely when human need becomes most desperate. The ambulances that might rush to help can't navigate streets that have become canals. Fire departments discover that their trucks can't pump water to fight fires when their water sources have been contaminated with salt. Police stations, usually built in central, accessible locations, find themselves cut off from the communities they serve by waters too deep for patrol cars and too dangerous for boats. And when the systems go dark, humanity turns to survival mode. The highways tell the story first. Interstate 95, that eastern corridor connecting Maine to Florida, becomes a river of desperation flowing inland. But these aren't the measured, planned evacuations we've seen for hurricanes or wildfires. This is every coastal resident in America trying to move inland simultaneously, with no advance warning, no staged departures, no organized relief centers waiting to receive them. Picture the entire population of New York City, 8 million people, trying to reach safety via just a few bridges and tunnels that remain above water. The Holland Tunnel is already flooded. The Brooklyn Bridge carries pedestrians only, as cars abandoned in the rising water create impassable barriers. The masses stream across the George Washington Bridge in a human river that moves barely faster than walking pace, carrying whatever they could grab in the panic of awakening to an impossible world. But where do 8 million people go when the world has changed overnight? The highways leading inland weren't designed for this kind of exodus. Route 80 West becomes a parking lot of humanity stretching from New Jersey into Pennsylvania. Cars run out of gas in the gridlock. Families abandon vehicles and begin walking, carrying children and pets and whatever possessions seemed most important in those frantic moments of departure. Small towns in upstate New York, places like Poughkeepsie and Albany that perhaps doubled their population for college football games, suddenly face an influx that multiplies their numbers by 10 or 20. Local emergency services, designed to handle small-town crises, collapse under the weight of processing climate refugees who arrive with nothing but the clothes they wear and stories of a world that no longer exists. The same scene repeats across America's coastlines. Miami's 5 million residents stream north on Interstate 75, but Orlando, itself dealing with displaced populations, can't absorb them all. They continue north, a human tide flowing toward Georgia, toward the Carolinas, toward anywhere that remains above the new waterline. Los Angeles empties inland through the mountain passes. But the Mojave Desert wasn't designed to support sudden cities of refugees. Phoenix and Las Vegas, already straining their water resources in normal times, watch in horror as millions of climate refugees approach cities that can't possibly accommodate them. The airports that might provide escape routes face their own impossible mathematics. Los Angeles International, built on land that's now underwater, no longer exists. San Francisco International disappears beneath the waves. Even airports that remain above the new sea level can't process the millions who need to fly somewhere, anywhere else. The entire commercial aviation system, built for predictable passenger loads and scheduled routes, breaks down when everyone needs to leave at once and nowhere can accommodate everyone who arrives. But where do you go when there is no safe ground left? The question haunts us because the flooding triggers disasters we never anticipated. Along the Gulf Coast, oil refineries that took decades to build begin their death throes in the first few hours. These industrial complexes, designed with safety systems for terrestrial emergencies, were never engineered to function while drowning. When salt water meets crude oil processing equipment, the results are catastrophic. Storage tanks rupture, spilling millions of gallons of petroleum products into the new ocean. The refinery fires that inevitably follow can't be extinguished by traditional means. You can't fight an oil fire with seawater. And the fresh water needed for firefighting is no longer available. The chemical clouds that rise from these industrial disasters drift inland on prevailing winds, poisoning the air that millions of climate refugees breathe as they flee to higher ground. Houston, America's energy capital, becomes ground zero for an environmental catastrophe that makes previous oil spills look small by comparison. Nuclear power plants face an even more terrifying scenario. These facilities, often built near water sources for cooling, have extensive safety protocols for many emergency scenarios, but not for sudden, complete submersion. When cooling systems fail and backup generators flood, we face the specter of multiple nuclear incidents occurring simultaneously along America's coastlines. The spent fuel storage pools at these facilities, designed to remain cool and contained, become underwater time bombs as their cooling systems fail and radioactive materials begin to leak into the new ocean. The exclusion zones around these facilities overlap with the paths that millions of refugees must travel to reach safety. Agricultural devastation compounds every other crisis. California's Central Valley, America's produce basket, faces saltwater intrusion that doesn't just destroy this year's crops. It renders the soil unusable for agriculture for years to come. The elaborate irrigation systems that turn desert into farmland become conduits for salt contamination, carrying destruction deep inland. Livestock operations, from cattle ranches to poultry farms, face immediate catastrophe. Animals that don't drown in the initial flooding face starvation as their feed supplies are destroyed and transportation networks collapse. The meat processing plants that form crucial links in America's food supply chain find themselves underwater or cut off from both their livestock sources and their distribution networks. The ports that handle America's international trade simply vanish. Los Angeles Long Beach, the nation's busiest port complex, becomes an underwater archaeological site. The container ships that were in port when the waters rose become artificial reefs, their cargo holds filled with everything from electronics to clothing that will never reach their intended destinations. Yet the most profound change isn't in the land, it's in the oceans themselves. The marine ecosystem doesn't pause to mourn human civilization. Within days of the Great Flooding, salt water begins its ancient work of reclaiming spaces that humans thought they had permanently claimed from the sea. But this isn't the gradual encroachment we might expect from normal sea level rise. This is a biological invasion happening at unprecedented speed. Shark populations, suddenly granted access to hunting grounds they've never known, begin exploring the drowned canyons that were once city streets. Great whites cruise through the underwater remains of Miami's financial district, their ancient navigation systems adapting to artificial reefs made from skyscrapers and shopping malls. Tiger sharks investigate the shadowy depths of flooded parking garages, drawn by the scent of decomposing organic matter trapped in submerged vehicles. The subway tunnels of New York become underwater caverns perfect for species that prefer dark, enclosed spaces. Moray eels establish territories in what were once turnstiles and ticket booths. Schools of fish that never swam farther inland than the harbor now navigate through Grand Central's submerged concourses, their silver bodies flashing in the green underwater light that filters down from far above. But it's not just large predators that transform our drowned cities. Jellyfish, those ancient drifters of the sea, find themselves perfectly adapted to life in humanity's abandoned spaces. Moon jellies pulse through the flooded lobbies of office buildings, their translucent bodies creating an otherworldly beauty in spaces designed for human commerce. Portuguese man-o-wars, those beautiful but deadly colonial creatures, establish hunting grounds in suburban neighborhoods where children once played in backyards. The invasive species problem becomes unlike anything marine biologists ever imagined. Waters that were once carefully separated by continents now mix in chaotic new patterns. Asian carp, already problematic in America's freshwater systems, discover saltwater territories they never could have reached before. European zebra mussels find new surfaces to colonize in the form of submerged automobiles and building facades. Marine vegetation begins the work of transforming architecture into ecosystem. Kelp forests take root on the submerged supports of bridges and highway overpasses, creating underwater forests where commuters once traveled. Coral larvae, carried by currents into waters far from their traditional ranges, begin experimental colonies on everything from fire hydrants to playground equipment. The fishing industry, such as it survives, discovers that traditional fishing grounds have been completely disrupted. The careful mapping of fish populations, the seasonal patterns that commercial fishermen depended on, become meaningless when the geography of the ocean changes overnight. Species that once lived in deep water now swim in what used to be river valleys. Fish that evolved in cold northern waters find themselves sharing space with tropical species in the newly merged ocean systems. But even if you survive the flood, there's a deeper enemy waiting: hunger. The mathematics of starvation begin with simple geography. America's most productive agricultural regions, California's Central Valley, Florida's citrus groves, The truck farms of New Jersey have either drowned completely or been poisoned by saltwater intrusion. The ports that imported food from around the world to supplement domestic production lie beneath hundreds of feet of seawater, along with their cargo and distribution networks. But the crisis runs deeper than destroyed farmland. The just-in-time delivery systems that keep America's grocery stores stocked were designed for a world with predictable transportation networks. When interstate highways become underwater canyons and railway lines disappear beneath the waves, the complex choreography of food distribution collapses entirely. Grocery stores in inland cities that escape the flooding find their shelves emptying within days, not because the food doesn't exist somewhere, but because it can't reach the people who need it. The refrigerated trucks that carry fresh produce across the continent can't navigate roads that no longer exist. The grain elevators that store wheat and corn become isolated. Islands in a landscape where ground transportation has become impossible, livestock operations face immediate catastrophe beyond just the animals that drown. In the initial flooding, the feed corn that keeps cattle operations running comes from fields that are now underwater. The transportation networks that move cattle from ranches to processing plants have been severed. Even ranches that survive the flooding find themselves cut off from the distribution systems that turn cattle into the beef that feeds America. Urban food security collapses in ways that reveal just how dependent modern cities are on global supply chains. New York City, even the parts that remain above water, normally receives food from hundreds of suppliers around the world. When the ports close and the highways wash out, 8 million people discover that their city produces almost no food within its boundaries. The grain supplies that form the foundation of the American diet, wheat for bread, corn for everything from tortillas to high-fructose corn syrup, become precious commodities as the agricultural regions that produce them disappear beneath salt water. The strategic grain reserves maintained by the government provide some buffer, but they were calculated for temporary disruptions, not for the permanent loss of entire agricultural regions. Fishing, that ancient human survival skill, offers little relief because the marine ecosystems have been completely disrupted. Fish populations that took decades to establish sustainable numbers scatter into new territories or die off as their food sources disappear. Commercial fishing vessels that survive the initial catastrophe discover that their traditional fishing grounds no longer exist, replaced by underwater cities where navigation is dangerous and fish populations are unpredictable. And when hunger spreads, so does conflict. The violence begins not with declarations of war between nations, but with desperate communities protecting what little remains. Small towns in upstate New York that once welcomed tourists now post armed guards at their borders, turning away climate refugees they simply can't accommodate. The social contract that holds civilization together breaks down when resources become scarce and survival becomes uncertain. State governments, overwhelmed by disasters beyond their planning, begin closing borders to residents of other states. Pennsylvania declares a state of emergency that effectively bars New Jersey refugees from crossing into their territory. The National Guard units deployed to maintain order face impossible choices between competing groups of American citizens, all with equal claims to safety and survival. Federal authority struggles to maintain legitimacy when the federal government itself is in crisis. Washington, D.C., built on reclaimed wetlands along the Potomac River, finds itself partially submerged and cut off from large portions of the country it's meant to govern. The continuity of government protocols were designed for nuclear war or terrorist attacks, not for the fundamental transformation of American geography. Agricultural regions that escape the flooding suddenly find themselves holding cards of unprecedented value. Kansas wheat farmers, Iowa corn producers, and Montana cattle ranchers discover that their products are worth more than gold in a world where food security has become the ultimate currency. But with traditional transportation networks destroyed, getting food from farms to hungry populations requires building entirely new distribution systems under emergency conditions. Water rights, always contentious in the American West, become matters of life and death when millions of climate refugees arrive in regions already struggling with drought. The Colorado River, already overallocated under normal circumstances, faces impossible demands as Phoenix and Las Vegas attempt to accommodate millions of displaced Californians. Armed conflicts erupt over access to freshwater sources that were never intended to support such massive populations. Military resources, stretched beyond breaking points, face challenges no military doctrine anticipated. How do you maintain civil order when half the country needs to relocate immediately? How do you distribute resources fairly when there aren't enough resources to meet everyone's needs? The armed forces find themselves choosing between humanitarian missions and maintaining basic security, between helping Americans and protecting American interests. International borders become flashpoints as America's crisis spreads globally. Mexico faces millions of American climate refugees streaming south, overwhelming border cities that lack the infrastructure to process such numbers. Canada implements emergency border controls as Americans flee north, creating refugee camps along the longest undefended border in the world. But in the ashes of war, could humanity still find a way to adapt? Human ingenuity, that remarkable capacity that built civilizations on every continent, begins to assert itself even amid catastrophe. In the flooded remains of Miami, enterprising survivors start constructing floating platforms from debris, pieces of buildings, abandoned vehicles, anything that can be lashed together to create stable surfaces above the waterline. These improvised floating communities, born from desperation, begin to develop their own economies and social structures. Skilled tradespeople who understand marine construction become the most valuable citizens in these aquatic settlements. Solar panels salvaged from submerged rooftops provide electricity. Rain catchment systems jury-rigged from building materials provide fresh water. Hydroponic gardens, constructed from materials scavenged from abandoned garden centers, begin producing food in spaces that were once parking lots. Engineering marvels begin to emerge as survivors adapt to their transformed world. In San Francisco Bay, floating cities anchored to the submerged remains of the Bay Bridge create new urban centers that rise and fall with the tides. These aren't the carefully planned floating cities that visionary architects once proposed. These are pragmatic assemblies of necessity, built from whatever materials survived the flood. The technology sector, concentrated in Silicon Valley before it became Silicon Lagoon, pivots to developing solutions for humanity's new challenges. Surviving tech companies focus on desalination technology that can be powered by renewable energy, communication systems that can function without traditional internet infrastructure, and food production methods that work in saltwater environments. Vertical farming, once a boutique solution for urban agriculture, becomes essential for survival. Abandoned skyscrapers and partially flooded cities are converted into growing towers, with each floor dedicated to producing food under artificial lights powered by rooftop solar panels. These vertical farms can produce fresh vegetables and fruits in spaces that once housed offices and retail stores. Transportation evolves to match the new geography. Boat building becomes one of the most essential skills in the new economy. Communities that once depended on highways develop networks of water taxis, cargo barges, and passenger ferries. Seaplanes, once luxury transportation for the wealthy, become essential lifelines connecting isolated communities across the vast new waterways. Energy production adapts to take advantage of new opportunities. Wave power generation, previously limited to coastal installations, now has access to much larger areas as wave action extends deep into what was once dry land. Offshore wind farms, no longer offshore but scattered throughout the new inland seas, provide renewable power for floating communities and elevated settlements. Yet, even with innovation, the question remains, could we truly thrive in a world half-drowned? As we drift back from this impossible scenario, floating on the calm waters of imagination toward the shores of our current reality, consider what this drowned world teaches us about the one we actually inhabit. The oceans won't rise overnight. Physics doesn't work that way, thankfully. But they are rising steadily and measurably. As global warming continues to melt glaciers and expand seawater through thermodynamics we understand all too well, the sea level rise we face in reality gives us something our imaginary disaster didn't. Time. Time to build seawalls and relocate communities. Time to develop floating cities and amphibious architecture. Time to strengthen food security and create resilient infrastructure. Time to address climate change before it addresses us with consequences we can't reverse. The cities we've imagined drowning overnight, New York, Miami, Los Angeles, are already spending billions of dollars on adaptation strategies. Sea walls and flood barriers, early warning systems and evacuation protocols, building codes that account for rising waters and storm surge. The technology to live with higher sea levels exists. The question is whether we'll implement it fast enough and comprehensively enough to avoid the worst scenarios. The social fabric that tore apart so completely in our fictional flood can be strengthened in reality through advanced planning, international cooperation, and social systems designed for resilience rather than just efficiency. The conflicts over resources and territory that seemed inevitable in our drowned world become manageable when there's time to negotiate agreements and build institutions capable of handling environmental challenges. But perhaps most importantly, our journey through this impossible scenario reminds us that the thin veneer of civilization we take for granted, the electricity that flows when we flip switches, the clean water that emerges from faucets, the food that appears on grocery store shelves, depends on systems that are more fragile than we usually acknowledge. The real oceans rise slowly, measured in inches per decade rather than feet per hour. But they rise nonetheless, carrying with them the same potential for transformation that we've imagined in our accelerated timeline. The difference is that we still have the opportunity to write a different ending to this story as you close your eyes tonight. Perhaps the gentle sound of waves reminds you not of destruction and chaos, but of the vast, patient power of the oceans and of humanity's remarkable capacity to adapt, survive, and sometimes even thrive in the face of challenges that once seemed impossible to overcome. The waters that seemed so threatening in our imagined disaster can also carry us forward, toward solutions we haven't yet imagined, toward a future where rising seas become not humanity's ending, but another chapter in our long story of adaptation and resilience. The waves lap gently now, carrying away the echoes of our drowned world, leaving only the quiet certainty that tomorrow's shores, whatever form they take, will find humanity still there to greet them.